Welcome to News from Neptune for the 40th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a socialist government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Historians consider a generation to be about 25 years, roughly the time it takes for you to get to the age your parents are now. For more than a generation, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. I'm now the age my parents would have been when we started the program. My eldest son is the age I was then. It's not been an encouraging 25 years. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for 3 generations. He wrote his first political article at the age of 10 on the fall of Barcelona to Franco's troops in the fraught year of 1939. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things in a Phoebe farce edition of NFN. Phoebe is the vocalization of the initials FBI. Our thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. I'll begin with a list of topics, and then we'll go to David's list. 1. Recommended viewing. John Pilger's interview on going underground. I'll put the link on the Facebook page. John Pilger talks about Julian Assange. Quote, Assange has shown that media is an appendage of established power. Pilger makes a detailed argument for the persecution of Assange, or the fact that Assange is being persecuted for these media violations. 2, war with Iran coming, an article by Patrick Coburn, one of the most insightful commentators on the subject, about the machinations of the U.S. In the Middle East, of the U.S. and Israel in the Middle East, aimed as it is at Iran. Should throw in there the U.S. other client in the region who is also perfectly happy to promote war with Iran, and that is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. 3, the new Venezuelan cryptocurrency Petro begins. 4, trade agreements still aren't good for the U.S. public. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, supposedly taking the place of NAFTA, is another neoliberal trap. Number 5, labor. Amazon raises its minimum wage to $15 an hour, increases the wage of those at Amazon already earning more than $50 an hour by $1 an hour. But who's paying for these wage increases? Jeff Bezos' record-setting wealth? No. Other Amazon employees. 6, Israel. An interview with Moshe Machover, Why is Israel a Racist State? Which I will also put a link on the Facebook page for. 7, breach. Facebook's 50 million accounts breach means profits for those selling account data on the black market, $3 per account. The dark web is the scene of this economic innovation. 8, identity politics. A new California bill, ostensibly to get more women hired onto company boards, seems to substitute discrimination for exploitation by class and seems likely to fail to affect the lives of most California women. 9, Russiagate. Russia is also to blame for Star Wars movie getting bad reviews, we're told. Yes, this is how desperate corporate media has become to avoid blame for anything. 10. Fraud is profitable, greed is good, but not for the public. The London Times reports that Google sold advertisements and advice to Times fake websites, pushing things as fake credit card that works, fake disability parking permits, etc. A scandal beyond these shores. 11. Recommended viewing. An interview with John Pilger by Afshin Rattansi on war with Iran, including Hillary Clinton's promise to obliterate Iran, U.S. obsession with Syria, and what's going on with Venezuela, and as I mentioned at the top, Pilger's take on Assange and more. And finally, I guess that's it. It's just a baker's dozen. Not even a baker's dozen as this time.
And we were just listening to the song Baker Street.
Yeah, there we are.
Before the show started.
The
classic Jerry Rafferty song.
We're baking all around.
Okay, well, just off the top of my head, before I get into the one thing that I really wanted to talk about, a nice interview on the podcast Moderate Rebels, which is usually hosted by Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal, but in this case was only hosted by Ben Norton, who did an interview with a Syrian who is in this country but returns there frequently, and who seemed to have a very clear head about what was going on over there. The fellow's name was, he only used one name, probably for identity protection purposes. He calls himself I think Asani, but a very engaging, quick-moving, clear interview from the point of view of someone who isn't accepting all of what we're hearing about the threat of genocide or massive casualties in Idlib province. I don't know what the final word is about that. I don't know what to think of some of it, but he touches all the bases regarding Idlib, Syria, the Kurds, the somewhat perhaps controversial American alliance with the YPG, with the Syrian Kurds. Very informative, one hour interview, very to the point, I think. It would be nice if I truly understood that what this guy is saying is true, or that he really knows what he's talking about, but it sure sounds like it. And what he's talking about is basically at variance from those on the left who think that Assad, who would criticize this man for supporting Assad. You won't find any criticism, any harsh criticism in this interview, and that concerns me a little bit, but that's something perhaps we can talk about. Also, just sort of left over, a lot of news about the economic, on the 10th anniversary of the financial crisis, a lot of analysis and debate about whether we are on the verge of another financial crisis in this country, what the indications and signs for that might be, and some contention on the liberal left about what this might be. And in fact, some liberals are kind of raising the volume about the possibility of another financial crisis. But the people that I respect most on these matters are saying no. There's not a financial crisis in the making right now. We must recall that there was not a serious financial crisis of that magnitude in this country between 1929 and 2008. And so there's no reason to believe that just because it's 10 years later than that there's going to be another crisis. The people I respect most about this, people like Dean Baker and Mark Weisbrot, argue that the housing bubble, there's nothing like the housing bubble of 2006 through 2008. There's nothing like that to create the conditions for a financial crisis like in 2008, with the caveat that things can happen around the world in places like Turkey and so forth that might create unforeseen problems. So I recommend two interviews or two debates on the Real News Network. one between Mark Weisbrot. It wasn't a fierce debate, but one between Mark Weisbrot and Gerald Epstein. Both are sort of left Keynesians who are interviewed frequently on TRNN, and slightly disagreeing about the possibility of a severe financial crisis, but basically agreeing that we can't predict that right now. Aside from that, I think it is important to separate our reference to financial crisis to the general economic picture, including that which is promoting the idea that things are getting better. Because as you read in the New York Times this morning, unemployment is down to 3.7% according to what the latest figures are from a month or two back. Well, or from last month anyway, from September. Well, again, it's always important to note what those figures really mean and question whether life is really getting better for people in the bottom 50% or even bottom 80%, whether wages that haven't increased in 40 or 50 years are really increasing in any appreciable way right now. And I think that needs to be looked at in a very critical way. And at the same time, we need to look at the difference between debating whether another 2008 financial crisis is going to happen or whether there can be a possible economic downturn, which is different, which it seems to be isn't often pointed out, although I think good economists understand this perfectly well. There's a difference between the kind of imminent financial crisis you had in 2008, which ended up lowering GDP by 4 or 5%, which is a monumental amount, putting millions of people out of work, and the kind of cyclical economic downturn that may happen when we look at, say, debt figures, private debt figures, corporate debt figures, and so forth. Public debt's overrated in that context, but in some contexts, even public debt figures would matter. But it's mainly the idea that when corporations and families have gone into debt, then there is, by some economic theory, by some proven or relatively sound economic theories, we are in relatively more danger of having spending cut back, having a downturn, having less consumption, putting people out of work, not to the extent of 2008. So it's important to kind of separate those two things. I don't think there's a rosy picture going on right now. The Trump expansion is certainly continuing the expansion of the Obama years, but it's a minor expansion in terms of increasing the standard of living of working class people. But it still should be seen as putting people to work. The question is, what is the quality of those jobs? What is the pay of those jobs? What is the prospect of those jobs? And let me mention one more thing, just in one word. Brazil. Brazil. Uh-huh. a good movie, but that's not what I was referring to.
Chomsky, our intellectual mentor, Noam Chomsky, has just published a note about his visit to Lula in prison,
yes, right.
Which focuses on what's going on in Brazil and its importance, for Brazil and for the United States, which is behind a good bit of the machinations, a good number of the machinations taking place in that country, as they were years ago when we casually overthrew the government of Brazil and put in one that we liked.
Are you referring back to the 1960s?
Yeah.
Okay.
These are days one hoped were gone forever, and there's a very real possibility that they weren't at all. On your economic reflections, David, apparently the Dow Jones Industrial Average has lost 500 points in the last 24 hours, yesterday and today. Pardon me. Down about 2%.
Right.
Is that important?
Probably not, but I don't. I don't want to sound like an economic expert here. But I mean, what the Dow Jones reflects is what people see in terms of what they think they see in terms of future profits, and it's all about profits. So it's the first thing to note is that whether the Dow Jones or the stock market goes up or down doesn't have a whole lot to say about the lives of ordinary people who don't own stocks.
That's a crucial point.
And it does have something to say about what mostly wealthy people and their technical representatives on Wall Street see to be sort of the near to midterm future about various industries jockeying around to create those profits. But I guess the simple answer to your question would be no, not unless it would have to be seemingly be more serious, or I guess the cliche would be that's just wealth that was lost on paper. That was just on paper in the first place. It's the rich people are feeling some billionaires are feeling 2% poorer this morning than they were 2 mornings ago.
Pity.
Yeah, it's rough. It's rough.
The real factor that both produced Donald Trump as president and also produces the populist wave that's occurring in this country and elsewhere is the accelerating growth in inequality in the country as a whole. Figures for Obama's first term are instructive here, and the figures have just continued from that first term of hope and change. In that term, overall income per family in the U.S. grew by about 7%. Overall income for family, that is, all the income growth for all the families in America.
Right.
The fact of the matter is, it was very, how shall we put it, unequally distributed. The top 1%, you've heard of them, the top 1% saw their real income grow by 35% in Obama's first term. Doing very nicely, thank you. The bottom 99% in this country saw less than a 1% gain. That means that the top 1% of the population captured more than 90% of all real income in those years. Now, in a situation like that, it's quite reasonable for most Americans to look around and say, what's all this talk about the economy doing so well? It's doing very well for the very rich, but here I am just where I was a few years ago. Wages in the U.S. have been effectively flat for 40 years since the advent of neoliberalism. What that means in people's lives is that the expansion, growth, development that they took for granted in their parents' lives a generation ago, we're talking about a generation here, that can't be taken for granted anymore. Probably it never should have been, but still in all, that apperception of the real situation of most Americans was the sort of thing that finally did produce Donald Trump as a critique of business as usual, which the previous administrations have brought us. That's not over. That's continuing. The American ascendancy does not want to admit the relevance of populism, and indeed wants to condemn it as some anti-American or perhaps fascist interference with our wonderful system. But in fact, that's exactly what's happening. That populism is growing, and it's growing because of the very real economic circumstances that hide underneath the notion that the economy is doing very well, thank you. The economy is growing. Yes, it is for Jeff Bezos, not necessarily for you and me.
Right, yeah.
Several points you made along the way.
Sure.
Are very worthwhile mentioning. I continue to be interested in the peculiar political fortunes of the proposals for a universal basic income. That's come as a bit of a surprise. It's not really championed by any of our traditional political parties, quite obviously. Oh, the Greens have talked about it, but it makes a great deal of sense that it is not on the agenda of the Republicans or Democrats, because the Republicans and Democrats are working for the very people whom a universal basic income would penalize in terms of that expansion of income that we were talking about a moment ago. A universal basic income would have some very interesting effects, include on everything from the price of labor to the what the Keynesians call aggregate demand, the sorts of things that fuels a capitalist economy in the modern world. That's the reason it's being talked about with some interest in a number of places, not the usual places where talk is not cheap, but very expensive, and we hear about it elsewhere. I think we may hear more of this as time goes on, as people like the populist light Bernie Sanders begins to consider the importance of this particular issue.
Yeah. I think for you, two caveats regarding universal basic income. It would have to go along with universal social welfare programs.
Exactly.
Like Medicare for all, or universal health care, or free higher education, or free early childhood education. It would have to go along with programs rather than just simply paying people more or less a poverty wage and still denying them the services to which they should be entitled to in our wealthy country. The other caveat would have to do with the debate that goes on between those promoting universal basic income and those primarily from the modern monetary theory school, which we talked about last week, or which I referred to last week, who primarily support what they refer to as the job guarantee, or JG. And they've been criticized recently for just using JG because people don't know what that necessarily means. So, but they've been criticized for more than that. But I think there's a healthy debate in terms of the necessity for giving people money and the necessity for putting people to work. And the argument, the sort of Keynesian argument of the MMT, modern monetary theory, is that if you're going to give people money, in order for that money to maintain its value, for the currency to maintain its value, you have to also put people to work making stuff or providing services. That means that the economy is growing in a way that will meet that demand. So one could see this as a kind of win-win debate, or one can see this as a sort of emphasis kind of thing, but still. That's the debate that goes on among sort of within the Keynesian left and beyond the Keynesian left towards the socialist democratic left. The universal basic income, UBI, has been talked about a lot on the Jacobin website, and also a somewhat more technical article in the Jacobin's relatively new, more academic organ, which is called Catalyst. I think from a couple of issues ago, or maybe 3 or 4 issues.
It would be helpful, I think, for our political discussion in this country if people began to realize what this might mean. Universal basic income, and once again, not just a pittance, but a universal basic income at the level of a living wage, would mean that people could work if they wanted to, but they would not be forced to in order to eat regularly. That would be a big change. That would be a remarkable change. American industry, American finance depend upon the most important goad to keep people working, that is hunger. And if that's taken away, suddenly you can decide if you don't want to do this sort of work, or if they're not offering a reasonable amount of recompense for you to do that work, you don't have to. That would be a major change, a substantial change, and one that American business fears. And they are fear that a political movement or movements may emerge in this country as a part of this inchoate populist wave demanding such a thing, a consummation devoutly to be wished.
Yeah, and also I guess debate about universal basic income obviously is in this economic context in which there's enormously complex factors working in terms of what is being made and what is being done and the choices that people have, and that also one of those contexts is certainly this trade agreement business. This just happens to be that they're putting in this NAFTA 2.0, which
Right.
hasn't, there. I don't even know that much about that. I read a little bit about that this morning. One leaves the criticism of that. One leaves it thinking that not a whole lot's going to change in a very meaningful way, and if it does, it's mainly for the worse. It's some pretty technical stuff, but what sticks out is the fact that the profits of the pharmaceutical companies are absolutely protected in this context of the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement, and that's a huge aspect of what NAFTA is, of what free trade is. The fact that pharmaceutical companies get to keep their patents, have their patents enforced, charge outrageous prices for their drugs, and however this agreement relates to the U.S., pharmaceutical companies, Canada, and so forth, people are probably going to have a harder time getting cheaper drugs. And of course, and this is something again, Dean Baker has been harping on this all the time for years now, that pharmaceutical patents cost us something like 2% of our GDP, or at least 1% of our GDP, a couple of $100 billion that shouldn't have to be being paid privately if only drug research were done in the public domain, funded by the public, not funded privately, for the purpose of then turning around and charging exorbitant patents on these very necessary drugs.
I think of this every time I see these television commercials for new and exotic drugs, which are going to do wonderful things for what it is you're suffering from, that you didn't realize perhaps you were suffering from, and that you didn't realize other people were suffering from.
Yeah.
But the commercials, as you know, are very slick. They're very careful. They're well produced. Should be. There's a lot of money in it. But the whole notion that drugs are a matter of private profit in America is nothing short of scandalous. If people need drugs, and if drugs can be developed that actually help people, then it should be done, as you say, socially. It should be a public matter. It is some places in this country. It's a private monopoly. And we should not have that. There should be more of a reaction to it, bound up with the need for general social support for medicine, the Medicare for All campaign that is, once again, obvious sense, and that the British, for example, were able to do at the end of the Second World War, even after being battered by that war in ways far beyond anything that happened in the United States. They were able to institute a national health service at the end of the war that was the equivalent of Medicare for all. Now, over the years, the British upper classes and the British Tory party have done scandalous things to that arrangement. But the idea that the U.S. can't afford Medicare for all when a war-destroyed country with Britain's economy could do it in 1946 seems to suggest that there's something wrong with the argument. That's something else we should be pressing for, along with Medicare for all. I have a note here for the from our researcher, Dr. No, about the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. He says, say goodbye to NAFTA. That was the agreement, if you want to call it that, negotiated by the Clinton administration that devastated Mexican agriculture, and once again for the benefit of American agribusiness and American private wealth. Say goodbye to NAFTA and hello to USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement that David was just talking about. It's still bad news for the public, says Dr. No. For example, and here's a point that our researcher is an expert on, and has not been much talked about in this regard. The USMCA extends Canada's copyright term to life plus 70 years. That is, if you establish a copyright on something, you have that copyright for your life plus 70 years after your life has come to its conclusion, i.e. can be passed on to your heirs or your company or what have you. This might not sound like a problem for the U.S., but it will be. Not only because the U.S. periodically engages in a scam called harmonization, where the U.S. makes its own term of copyright longer. We harmonize it with a better arrangement for the rich few that Canada does on something like this, but because more fields are subject to the monopolization copyright is designed to implement. Take farmers, this is an interesting example, something I knew nothing about, but it makes sense. Take farmers with American tractors. Some tractors are designed to deny the farmer full control over their own equipment. To avoid the draconian locks that John Deere puts on the tractors they buy, farmers throughout America's heartland have started hacking their equipment with firmware that's cracked in Eastern Europe and traded on invite-only paid online forums. It's illegal. So it's the dark web that tells farmers how to fix their tractors, because the information about how to deal with those computers is copyrighted. It's held privately by the company that makes the tractor. Tractor hacking is growing increasingly popular because John Deere and other manufacturers have made it impossible to perform, quote, unauthorized, close quote, repair on farm equipment, which farmers see as an attack on their sovereignty and quite possibly an existential threat to their livelihood if their tractor breaks at an inopportune time. Quote, when crunch time comes and we break down, chances are we don't have time to wait for a dealership employee to show up and fix it. Quoting a hog farmer in Nebraska who testified to the state legislature earlier this month. Most all the new equipment requires a download to fix. This nightmare scenario, and a fear I heard expressed over and over again in talking with farmers, is that John Deere could remotely shut down a tractor and there wouldn't be anything a farmer could do about it. In other words, if they tried to mess with the control that's built into the software. What makes it possible for a tractor to have something to do with copyright law? Tractors are controlled by computers now, and that means they're subject to control by software the tractor's ostensible owner doesn't have any control over, proprietary software, that is, belongs to somebody else. So when something breaks and the farmer needs their tractor fixed ASAP, digital locks stand in the way of the farmer fixing their own tractors. These digital locks are known as DRM, which means Digital Restrictions Management, if you stand with the user class, because that term lays out the effect on the users. DRM means Digital Rights Management, if you stand with the publisher class, those who impose their power over the users. We've seen this play out in other computer software, such as software one runs on personal computers. The fight is the same, but the consequences are far more serious than trying to play a video game and being told you don't have a right to the software. When a Digital Millennium Copyright Act exemption was passed in 2015 that allowed users to modify, quote, computer programs that are contained in and control the functioning of a motorized land vehicle, such as a personal automobile, commercial motor vehicle, or mechanized agricultural vehicle, when circumvention is a necessary step undertaken by the authorized owner of the vehicle to allow the diagnosis, repair, or lawful modification of the vehicle function, close quote. John Deere changed how they sold their tractors to require the user to license the proprietary software in the tractor. Now, this thing is affected very much the declining class of independent farmers, small farmers, farmers not part of vast agribusiness, which can make their own arrangements with proprietary software owners, but for the decreasing number of America's independent farmers, it's another blow and another move against them. There's no reason to assume that this sort of thing will not be extended to other areas in the country where copyright law turns out to be a method of control by producers of software. This is a detail, but a detail that is profoundly affecting at least some people in the country, and threatens in various ways to affect a good number of others. This is not the sort of thing we should allow to happen, and it's written into this new Canadian-Mexican-American agreement on agriculture. We are properly forewarned, I think, by people who've been paying attention to these things.
The same argument I've heard recently made about not just about tractors but about cars.
Yes.
That the guys, mostly guys, who used to work, pick up a few skills and get into cars and open up a little business fixing their friends' cars or people they know, can't do that anymore because they don't have access to the. They could perfectly well understand how to use some of that computer technology, but they don't have access to it.
And it's illegal if they do gain access to it.
So the question is, as somebody who's driven a car for the last 50 years or owned a car for the last 45 years, most of that time, if I was fortunate enough to, cars do seem better than they once did. It seems like computers have made cars better. The question is how rich some corporations should have to get for cars to be better, and when one deals with the local Toyota dealership or whatever, one really finds out what's going on with that. They provide good service, but they want to own you. They want you to think that they're the only place you can go to get the right work done, and in some instances that might be for a good reason or for a bad reason. But at a broader level, the question is how rich, how does innovation happen? What is it that really encourages innovation? And there's this, especially in this academic community, there's this sort of mystique about innovators, identifying innovators with job creators and all that kind of stuff. But what the reality is that the people who do the innovating aren't always the ones getting rich. It's the corporations. Yes, they can get rich. They could sell it to a corporation and get some money, but then the corporation gets a whole lot richer by monopolizing the use of that technique. The question is, how rich should people be able to get when they build on the social capital that the living here, the educational social capital that living in this country provided them with? How much of the wealth should they be able to grab from that and sort of abscond with, whether they become part of the 10%, the 1%, the 0.1%? The short answer is that socialism is the answer to all these seeming contradictions. The idea that these people should work in the public context. They should offer their skills to the public context. Their basic needs should be taken care of in this public context. People shouldn't be allowed to become billionaires or multimillionaires in this public context. And we will still have all the things going on because people are people and people want to have fun thinking about better ways of doing things. And they don't necessarily have to get rich for doing so. They can still do it. But the ruling class wants us to think that it's only by getting filthy rich that people will get out of bed every morning and think something up.
I'm less concerned about the very rich and what they're doing and whether indeed they should be allowed to do that for themselves. I'm less concerned about that than the other end of the scale, the vast majority of humanity that's very poor.
Of course.
And that's indeed what we should be concentrating on. If Jeff Bezos wants to sit on his money, that's fine. That's his business. We might want to talk about tax policies and so forth that would tax wealth rather than income and see if that would make a difference. But finally, it would not make a difference in the sense sense that the poor people are poor only because Jeff Bezos is rich. I saw a couple of things this week where people pointed out, or at least made the argument, that world hunger could be eradicated if Bezos' fortune were confiscated and used to eradicate your world hunger. Okay, that may be true and that may be worthwhile, but Jeff Bezos is not the only place where we can get the money.
Absolutely.
And your discussion of monetary theory makes that clear.
Yes.
So the point is not that Jeff Bezos is hoarding all the money and therefore we can't feed poor people. The point is that we've decided not to feed poor people, and therefore Jeff Bezos can go do what he wants with his money. The real tasks are social tasks, tasks that should be taken care of, and along the way we may want to talk about tax proposals and whatnot, but that's not stopping us from doing it.
No,
and that's the important thing.
But the question, becomes, what is all of this massive accumulation of wealth by relatively few people distorts the political process by which any of those changes can happen. Jeff Bezos isn't just some neutral observer. He and his class of people are the ones that keep the two-party duopolistic system going the way it is, that keep the Supreme Court, ultimately keep the Supreme Court going, ruling in favor of corporations. So you gotta, in order to deal, it's more important to tax wealth to deal with power than it is to tax wealth to feed poor people. It's only through political change that you're gonna feed those poor people.
That's right.
So yeah, I would take it a step further in that regard.
I'm looking here for a piece that I read a week or two ago on the conspiracy of the rich, so to speak, that has the interesting characteristic, the piece has the interesting characteristic of having been written 500 years ago. A quotation from Thomas More's Utopia, a novel written in the 16th century, in which the conspiracy of the rich to aggrandize themselves at the expense of the community is condemned by a man who could see it happening around him, a educated Chancellor of England, writing in the early years of the 16th century. Now, these are problems that are solvable. We keep hearing accounts of why they aren't solvable, and things just have to be the way they are,
yes.
And we've been hearing them for at least 500 years.
That's way too long to be hearing something that's wrong. But that's capitalism.
I want to switch the discussion for a moment to something else that Dr. Noam has told us about for this week, and that is weapons deals. One of the ways in which the rich get rich is by keeping their stocks, keeping their money in defense stocks. What a nice sounding term. Obviously you want to be defended, therefore defense stocks are good things, but what we mean by defense stocks are weapons makers, people who produce the vast amount of armament that is used around the world, principally by the world's largest military budget, that of the United States. Our attention is drawn to weapons and nuclear deals that are being made between other countries. Russia and India are in the midst of a weapons deal, and it's hard not to see the U.S. presence in South Asia as being the occasion for this deal. Russian Prime Minister Putin meets with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the two talk about weapons deals, specifically the S-400 air defense system, worth billions of dollars, if you want to buy one. This S-400 system is the system that is being discussed in regard to Syria and Russia's attempts to defend Syria against the depredations of the U.S. and Israel. But now we hear a discussion about this weapons systems and India, and it's part of a general discussion in which Russia is talking with India about setting up a nuclear power facility for that country. The U.S. threatens sanctions against any country that works with Russia on arms deals. Now, that's very interesting indeed. I mean, the notion that other countries don't have the right to buy and sell weapons unless the U.S. says it's okay is a peculiar sort of notion and hardly a level playing field, so to speak. Why India, though? What is the U.S. concerned about here? The U.S. Foreign policy for more than a century has been concerned about the economic integration of Eurasia, Europe and Asia, in a way that would hamper the U.S. 1%'s ability to exploit East Asia, Eurasia in general. And so the U.S. is particularly concerned about preventing the weaponization of people who might resist the U.S. insistence on controlling the economy of that region. The U.S. is shocked to hear that China is selling drones to Gulf countries. After all, if people are going to assassinate people around the world with drones, only the U.S. should be allowed to do it. It's certainly worthwhile to try to prevent drone assassinations, but the U.S. does it only because it needs to maintain its own monopoly and destroy what is, in fact, one of the most important political developments in the world today, the Chinese BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, in which China integrates Eurasia with a system of transportation by sea and by land that involves India and the Persian Gulf. This is the sort of thing that U.S. foreign policy is concerned about, the sort of thing U.S. foreign policy has been concerned about for more than a century. We're not going to quit anytime soon. The interesting thing is that the U.S., from a peak of control of the world, and particularly of this region, at the end of the Second World War, is necessarily declined relatively from those days as the countries of the region, most notably China, and to some extent India, developed themselves. That's what keeps the lights burning late in Froggy Bottom, where the State Department is located, and the American political system paying closer and closer attention to what's being done by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative as a check on American exploitation of the region. We can't have that, and we're willing to kill a lot of people, as we did in Korea and Vietnam, to make sure that doesn't happen. It's a very dangerous situation.
So, what is your perspective on Idlib?
Well,
I mean, do you have a comment? I know I mentioned that before in terms of the interview I recommended on Moderate Rebels, the podcast. But there on the one hand, there was a whole lot written about how horrible it was going to be, and on the other hand, there seems to be kind of a news blackout on what's actually going on there. So,
well, I think one of the reasons is that there has been a sort of a standoff amongst the belligerents in Syria. Idlib is the region in North Syria adjacent to Turkey where a lot of the jihadists that the U.S. has been sponsoring against the government of Syria have settled and maintained some degree of maintained independence from the central Syrian government, the government of President Assad. The situation is stable, so to speak, for the moment, if we compare it with the horrible massacres that have occurred elsewhere throughout the region as the U.S. has moiled about in Middle Eastern politics. Certainly it's better that people not be killed in Idlib, particularly civilians, to say nothing of the jihadists who control the region. And that's what Russia and Turkey primarily have worked out. A demilitarized zone around Idlib, the removal of the heavy weapons in Idlib to Turkey, and a status quo with little or no direct military engagement in the region. There has been great talk about how the U.S. was encouraging a false flag poison gas attack in Idlib that would be a justification for the U.S. to attack Syria's military pressure on the Idlib region in defense of those poor people who were gassed. In fact, that has not taken place, and it's not taken place because of the Turkish-Russian agreement, an agreement that for the moment has limited the fighting in Syria and has prevented Syria, of course, from regaining control of its revolting province. What that portends for the future is not at all clear, but it seems to me that those people who are clamoring for a military attack on Idlib have some explaining to do, and the folks who
you mean a U.S. military intervention in
well, of course, the U.S. military is present in the region, and it would be U.S. air power that would be necessary to retake Idlib. So in this sense, it is a restraint of what the U.S. is doing in the region that is a result of the standoff with Russia and Turkey. That can't be bad in and of itself. On the other hand, it is a continuation of the jihadist revolt against the Syrian government that the U.S. has supported since the Obama administration.
Yeah. Part of the debate, on a perhaps somewhat lighter note, let me say that part of the discourse about Syria and the back and forth in terms of Assad, etc., seems to center on the fact of whether people get too old to make any sense anymore. And so both Noam Chomsky and Seymour Hersh have, from some quarters, been among people who might have respected their work or mostly respected their work. All of a sudden, either these men are too old to be making any sense because they're not anti-Assadist enough to satisfy some people. But having said that, let me read a small excerpt, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Actually, you probably will mind. Okay. But from Paul Street. From this morning's counterpunch, pardon?
Yes, go ahead. But Paul Street is a friend of this ground with whom we don't always agree.
No, not always, but I kind of thought this would be fun to read in a strange sort of way. It was good to see people occupying parts of the U.S. Capitol yesterday in response to the authoritarian and sexist absurdity of the Kavanaugh nomination process. Sure, it sometimes looks goofy, but our only hope starts with mass and long-term rebellion and the collapse of absurd and hierarchical structures like the U.S. capitalist and imperial state. Consent to unjust power and undeserved authority must be actively, militantly, and permanently withdrawn. It is very important to rebel. It's only the first step, but you haven't lived until you've rebelled alongside others. The more and more militantly, the better, along with a coherent set of demands and a vision of alternative programs and institutions and an alternative society. And then he goes on, As a South Sider of Chicago, I could not feel too much pain over the total season-ending humiliation of the Chicago Cubs. Two different teams celebrating postseason victories on their home field 2 days in a row. The Milwaukee Brewers on Monday and the Colorado Rockies on Tuesday. I found this disgraceful exit especially delicious in light of Yahoo Sports revelation that the right-wing oligarch and Cubs owner Todd Ricketts funds ads that support the open liar, accused rapist, and right-wing torture advocate Kavanaugh's quote-unquote strong moral character. So long, Kavanaugh cubbies. The next World Series in the North Side's super white Wrigleyville is scheduled for 2087, by which time Ricketts' beloved profit system will have long melted the Antarctic, if not abolished first in the name of the common good. I know it leaves you speechless in so many levels, but...
And on that note, we might point out that the real baseball confrontation begins tonight.
Of course.
Between the Boston Red Sox
We keep our priorities
that
straight.
hive of viciousness, the New York Yankees.
We're looking forward to a Boston Dodgers World Series. That's going to be something.
That wouldn't be bad. That wouldn't be bad at all.
Anyway.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 40th week of 2018, a Phoebe farce edition. And we mentioned the FBI's farcical activities only in passing or only by reference here at the very end. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Aware, the local anti-war, anti-racism effort will have its regular monthly anti-war demonstration tomorrow, Saturday, October 6th, in downtown Champaign at Main and Neal Streets from 2 to 4 p.m., thankfully before the Red Sox-Yankees playoff game begins. You're invited to join us in this demonstration against the U.S. ongoing wars. We'll have signs and flyers to distribute. Aware will also have a table at the Lincoln Square Farmers Market on the second and fourth Saturdays of the month. Is that not true, David?
Yeah, tomorrow is the first Saturday of the month. So
come by and talk about what can't be talked about on the evening news, America's war-making around the world. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere from The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.